Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to this Interpres live stream. My name is Ron Eddings. I will be your moderator for this live stream. We have two amazing speakers that are part of this live stream. One is the host of this live stream who was gracious enough to come and invite me and to also host. The first speaker that we have is Pat Arvidson. Pat is the Chief Strategy Officer at Interpres. Pat, I'll let you start out by sharing a little bit about Interpres and also telling us about your role at Interpres.
Well, thanks, Ron. So before I get into that, right, I want to thank you and everybody at Hacker Valley Media, plus everybody on the chat and our special guest today, and my friend and probably a stalwart figure in the area of cybersecurity, Roger Hockenberry, for joining us today. And it's going to be an interesting session, right? So a little bit on Interpres and then a little bit about myself, right? So at Interpres Security, we offer the market a quantifiable approach to understand how your cyber defenses stack up to specific adversarial threats targeting your organizations. Now, for the context of this conversation, just a little bit about who I am. I spent 36 years in the federal government. For those years, I was the Senior Information Assurance Liaison to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So I wrote a lot of policy with 26 other nations that don't all speak English. And I spent a couple years in the Pentagon overseeing all things cyber within the Principal Cyber Advisor's Office.
Excellent. Appreciate that. Thank you for that rundown. And again, thank you to Interpres for hosting this event. Be sure to also give their page on LinkedIn a little bit of love, give them a follow. Also, be sure to engage into the comments as we go. The second guest and special speaker that we have is Roger Hockenberry. Roger is the CEO of cyberconIQ. Roger, welcome to the stream. Would love to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about your background and what you're doing over at CyberCon.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Hey, good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I just joined as the CEO of CyberCon a few months ago, maybe in September. We offer a human defense platform where we actually measure human risk factor in the enterprise from a cyber perspective, have an educational program to change behavior that's patented, and we also offer an effective dashboard which helps you manage cyber risk in the enterprise, which will be very important to this meeting that we're going to have today, talk about the SEC. Prior to that, I was the CEO of Cognitio, a company that I founded almost 10 years ago, which did a lot of work in cybersecurity risk assessments and remediation. Prior to that, I was at the CIA as a CTO and a director of operations, working on global technology deployments and also working for the CIO on our cloud strategy, which led to a purchase of a copy of the Amazon cloud called C2S. I think that's enough. We can keep going on, but why? plus, I know Pat, and that should tell you everything you want to know.
Yeah. That's the one bad mark on his career.
That's right. One small thing.
We are gathered here to talk about a topic that's probably near and dear to many of the members in the audience's heart, and it's how can we defend ourselves? Not just defending our organization, but defending ourselves as individuals. There was a tweet storm, a news storm that just went down with the SEC filing charges against the CISO of SolarWinds, and it kind of sparked a lot of conversations. I've been knowing Interpres for a bit, and we thought it would be a great idea to open up the conversation amongst us, but to also engage with the audience. So let's kind of recap for a second, right? Pat, what transpired with the recent news? Kind of give us a quick snapshot of what happened, just in case anyone's not filled in yet.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. There's two things that we have to keep in mind on this, right? The first one is the charges, which everybody is talking about, and it's causing a lot of angst and consternation, right? And that first one is about the charges where the SEC has indicted SolarWinds and its CISO, right, for fraud and internal control failures relating to allegedly known cybersecurity risk and vulnerabilities, right? So they're saying, hey, you knew about this, and guess what? You committed fraud, right? Basically, They're using kind of their authorities that much like they would use for banking or an Enron or somewhere along those lines, right? The second thing to understand is that back in July, the SEC adopted a new set of rules. And a lot of people remember that because there was this thing about reporting material breaches within 4 days, 48 hours, whatever it is. But more importantly was, for the frame of this context of this conversation, there was a piece on there on how you were supposed to report your methodology underneath your annual submission to manage material risk, which was, hey, you need to have a dedicated process that assesses, identifies, and manages material risk. So the two big things that we're going to keep in mind today are, one, the charges for fraud, and two, the assess, identify, and manage material risk.
Excellent. Let's definitely do that. To kick that off, I think we got to also kind of take a walk down memory lane as to the role of the CISO, because a lot of this is their responsibility. Of course, they're going to have their teams kind of help them carry on that responsibility. But, looking back maybe 5-7 years ago, and then today, what is the role of CISO? I hear so many things about what a CISO is and what it isn't.
Roger, I'll let you go ahead and take a stab at that one first. Right?
Just throw that right to me. So I think there's a lot going on. So if you actually take a look back through history from the tech days in 2000 and up until now, there's been this sort of evolution that's occurred in the enterprise, moving away from like a practitioner, more toward an individual who's going to be responsible. It started off with a CIO, then a CTO. So the CISO role is just an out branch of that, where people recognize that security is of equal importance. In fact, with the SEC, what you're really seeing is the maturation of cybercrime and cybersecurity becoming an equal business impact situation. And people actually have to really measure that. Now there's going to be a lot of pressure on a CISO. And you see that with SolarWinds particularly. Not only do you have to disclose timely, you also have to show every year how you're effectively managing cyber risk and how you're extending that capability beyond the tactical edge. And I think that now the CISO role is going to become even more important, but the risk that's involved in that and the stakes are getting even higher. And I think the SEC is sort of making an example or a case with SolarWinds to say, hey, we're taking this serious, and everyone else should. In fact, part of what you're going to have to do is illustrate that you have cybersecurity capability or talent on your board. You're also going to have to show how you're managing that. And that every year you're going to have to show what you're doing in order to make sure that is an equal business risk and how that can impact shareholders, stock price. And now there's liability attached to it that's real. It's giving it teeth. It's very interesting. So the role of the CISO is evolving more from just somebody who's taking care of some of the what I would call legacy security and having to become somebody who is very adept at cyber intelligence, cyber defense, communication, and governance, and really expanding that role beyond where they are today. I mean, Pat, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's in a simpler term, right? It 4 or 5 years ago, or even maybe in smaller companies 6 months ago. Of course, we're talking about publicly traded companies, right?
Right.
6 months ago, the CISO was the person, right, that kind of did cybersecurity. Right now, of course, they had people around them. They had other things like that, right? What it's evolving into is you have to be the strategic planner for the organization, right? So when you talk about strategic planning, you're talking about what is the environment that we're operating in? What is the end state that we're trying to get there? What are the ways that we're going to do about it? And what are the resources that we need, right? So if you want to look at it from like a military construct or an organizational construct, the CISO is going from a mid-level manager, mid-level officer, right up to a general, right up to an executive, right? And they have those responsibilities. And if they're not prepared for them, they're going to get crushed.
But even more than that, Pat, I think that because it's a C-suite job, right? And I think where you're going to see a lot of issues, because we just recently did some work with a bank. They didn't have a CISO. So they were getting one. But the reality is, okay, in the event of a cyber incident, eventually you're going to have one. where's the authority to make a decision? So is it going to rest with the CEO? Is it going to rest with the CISO? Does the CISO have more authority to make that decision over a CEO? Who has the actual competence? You and I were talking about this the other day when we said, okay, well, an insurance company is going to come in and they're going to want to, remediate. So are their decisions going to take paramount? Are they more important than a CISO's? Who has the expertise to decide what you're going to do? And I think that role is going to have to really become better defined, because at a certain point, you're going to have to take action. And in that action, you're going to have to say, this is what we're going to do, and be constant about it, and not be questioned by somebody who maybe isn't quite as technically adept, right? Because this is a real technical problem, but you got to be able to articulate that in very non-technical terms for people. Yeah. And
so I agree with you. I wrote a white paper on this. It's on our website on the CISO landing page, right? That talks about well-reasoned and defendable, right? And that's a term from policy. It's a term from, jurisprudence that basically says, the plan that you put in place doesn't make logical sense.
Right.
Is it based upon fact, right? You can't do it based upon emotion. You have to base it on fact. And then the back thing is it defendable? Because you're right. You're going to get hit,
right,
and you're going to get sued, whether it's an SEC indictment or it's shareholders coming after you in a class action, right? You have to come up with, hey, here's my logical plan. It makes sense. And oh, by the way, I can defend it in a court of law.
Yeah, and you saw that with Caesars, right? They voluntarily disclosed before the event, and now there's like 8, I think, class action lawsuits, and they're facing a lot of trouble and a lot of pressure. Now, typically in the past, a cyber incident, if disclosed, would make your stock price dip for a while, and you would fire the CIO and the CTO. But generally, everything would recover. That's like Target. But now what you're seeing is, with this jurisprudence, is they're building out a tort law that says, what is the real role of a CISO and what's your responsibility? And from a tech perspective, as you see with SolarWinds, if I'm the CISO of SolarWinds and I know that we have vulnerabilities and I haven't reported them, well, everybody's purchased my product. Am I liable for that? It's very interesting to me, and I think there's going to be a lot of turbulence for a while until it settles out.
Yeah, and don't forget, right? It's an interesting case that, and we don't know how that case is going to work out and stuff. But since it's a publicly traded company, let's play the game where the CISO says, I told the board decided not to do it. So guess what? I decided to go whistleblower. I'm now covered in Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So, what? Right? So
he's liable.
There's like chaos everywhere in this whole place. Right?
I don't even know if I'd want to be a CISO right now. I mean, think about that pressure that you're going to have, especially if you don't have the authority to act. I mean, I would want to renegotiate my job contract and say, look, I have to have the authority to take action, even if I'm countermanded or something by the CEO. What's more reasoned and logical, right, and to do in these instances? And I think there's just going to be a lot of turbulence around that. And it will be very interesting to see. But I'm also very interested to see how many companies now are going to actually have to disclose that they had a cyber incident. And because that usually that's buried back in like page 12 or 15 or 100, right?
From a CISO perspective, I don't think that releasing the fact that you got hit, right, is going to have that much of an impact anymore, right, on your day-to-day job outside the class action lawsuits. Don't get me wrong, right? I think really what's going to have more of an impact, though, is trying to build that business case that says, this is how I assessed the threat, this is how I identified the threat, this is how I managed it, right? Because as long as you have that good plan, you're okay, right? Even if you put together a good plan and somebody else outvotes you, I think it's going to be very hard to take you to court.
I think so too.
Or at least win. Yeah. Anyway.
All right, what's next, Ron?
I'm glad that we're talking about that. You said that is a little dangerous to be a CISO right now. I would agree. But there is this report by Hitch Partners that has the average salary for a CISO, and it's right around $700K total package. I think it's a tremendous salary, but that with every cost comes with great responsibility. I think it's a lot of responsibility to take on. There's someone from the comments that just came in, Ryan Jameson, said it's not a C-suite job. It's a C job, but it doesn't come with that big level seat that CISOs need. And I think that begs the question, like, what are the expectations for the CISO? And do those expectations line up for the SEC?
Well, I think that's what's going to change, right? So I think now you could say a lot of companies will have a chief security officer, a VP of security. They have somebody who's a little low level, but Pat said that it's now not a mid-level manager job. This is a C-suite job.
Right.
And you're going to have that authority. So people are going to have to up level what they're doing. And I think that there's going to have to be more work on what is education, what qualifies you to be reasonable and make sound judgment in these issues, because I think there's a lot of difference. And because I think the top tier might be 700K. I don't know what the lower tier is, but boy, maybe I'll reconsider and become a CISO now.
So I'm woefully underpaid if that's the case, right?
Exactly.
But the other point on this is I want to make sure everybody understands this. It's not going to solve the problem.
No.
Right? Putting a CISO on the board of directors or somebody who's smart in security on the board of directors is not going to change the problem.
No.
At the end of the day, right, cyber, now that we have cybercrime as a pillar, right, as an industry vertical, right, is a resource battle. It's flat out a resource battle. There are going to be CISOs that are going to lose resource battles in the boardroom. It doesn't matter how well you articulate it. It's just going to come down to the fact of, hey, it's not. And the way you shape that, right, and the SEC is telling you to shape it this way, right? They're saying assess your threat, right? So in the SEC indictment, they use the term threat or threat actor 88 times. They use risk 91 times.
Right.
From a guy that's written policy for a long, long time, I'm telling you that's intentional, right? What they're saying is figure out the threats that are targeting you, build your program to counter those threats, right? And then manage your systems to counter those threats. And if you do those kind of things, you're okay, right? But the days of walking into the C-suite and saying, hey, I need a spear phishing control because we're going to get spearphished isn't going to fly, right? And it never was going to fly.
No, and I think for you, Pat, this is where Interpres comes in because you have a really interesting platform and capability. And I also think this is where CyberCon plays because what we're constructing is really an effective way to manage return on security investment. So the bigger problem has always been, well, if I spend $10 million on security versus 20 million, if I spend 20 million, am I twice as secure? And the answer is typically no. So the problem is how are you choosing any one of these capabilities to deploy into your enterprise? And that's why I think when you and I first talked when Interpres was starting up, and I was really impressed with Interpres, and thought it was really good. And I thought that was something that was really unique that I hadn't seen really out in industry as of yet. So I think you're going to have to start looking for a new way to assess companies, assess risk, figure out what you're really going to deploy and how are you effectively managing that. And that's where I think the two of us really could work together on that very well. It jives, in my opinion.
Yeah, it works. It's like free range jazz. Go back to your music stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, I agree, Ron. I think that the role of the CISO is going to have to evolve over time. And they're going to have to be given more authority and budget in order to make better decisions, just to secure the enterprise, or at least be able to identify the risk more appropriately.
Right.
Yeah.
There was some very specific language that both of you all are using. Pat, you kind of brought it up first with the mentions in the report, threat, and I know one thing that Interpres is very focused on is a threat-informed program, like building your program's practices and principles being informed by how threats operate. There's one term that you say all the time. It almost reminds me like I'm doing some type of philosophical exercise, but you say well-managed and defendable when you think about the approach that CISOs need to take. What does that mean, and how do you make sense out of that, very simple term?
Does what you're doing make logical sense? Right? That's what it means, right? So in cyber or within the SEC, what the SEC is saying are the things that you're doing make logical sense. So are you patching the right things? Not that you're patching, are you patching the correct things, right? Do you have the right capabilities in your network, right? So how do you figure that out, right? And that's the framework they're talking about with assess, which is you build a threat model, who you are, right? You understand your industry vertical, you understand how big you are, right? You understand what kind of data you're trying to protect. And then you curate intelligence. Didn't say generate, you curate intelligence that says, hey, these are the groups that are targeting me. And these are their TTPs that they're using. All right, great. I take those things and I say, these are the vulnerabilities they're targeting. I'm going to prioritize those, right? So I take the threat that's coming after me. I prioritize the things that they're going to come after. That's my prioritization model for my vulnerability patching system. And then I configure my defensive controls to protect and detect and respond against those, which, I hate to tell you this, but this is what Interpres does, right? It's a program I led in the government because it works. And if you mind me doing an analogy, right? You don't pack your suitcase for a trip down to Roger's house in Florida with parkas in it.
Right.
Because you realize you're going to some place that's sunny. Maybe you take a raincoat, but you don't take a parka. And cyber, we like to boil the ocean and say, what if, but what if, but what if, right? That's not going to work. It's not going to work, right? And oh, by the way, just to give you that what if, the SEC actually says this doesn't apply to 0 days.
That's right. So as you and I know, 0 days are sort of a misnamed thing. Nobody has a 0 day. They're usually resident in your enterprise for 9 or 12 months, and then they decide to activate them. There's no such thing as an immediate attack that's usually successful. But I think what you're touching on is that almost every publicly traded company is now going to have to be their own small intelligence agency, and building out a lot of, as you say, curated information about where attacks are, what they face every day, and how are they disseminating that and talking about it at the board level, at the manager level, at the employee level, right? Because
so kind of, right? I hate to tell you this because we do it automatically, right? But the way we do it is we take it from CISO, right? So we take it from CISO, FBI, NSA, cybercom, right? That kind of way. And I'll tell you right away, if you go into a court of law and the SEC says, we're charging you because you didn't address this threat, and you say, yeah, but I addressed every threat that CISO told me to address, you're kind of okay, right? The government told me to do this, so I did that. Now you're telling me I shouldn't have done what the government told me to do?
Well, I mean, that's the point, right? Is that you don't know, it's the unknown knowns, right? To go back to that from a long time ago. And I think in the end, what you have to do is most companies, they can't, you want to just reduce the attack surface as much as you can. The probability of being attacked is 0 or 100%, right? You're either attacked or you're not. What you're looking at is a potentiality number, right? So what's the potential exposure that I have on any given day? And what is that going to actually cost me to recover? And how much do I have to recover? And how do I quickly assess the damage? And how do I replace things, right? Or repair things while keeping all of our enterprise running and not losing any revenue? Because it's just going to get worse. So everyone has to become more adept at finding information, identifying those priorities, disseminating all that within their own enterprise, and then making sure that it's seen as an equal risk to anything else. And most of the time it's reputational risk, right? And that's what hurts most. Again, going back to this other company, they're like, we don't pay ransomware. You and I talked about this. And then the next paragraphs are like, well, maybe we do. And it's like, okay, most people don't understand how to actually purchase Bitcoin. And then secondly, if you actually purchase Bitcoin and pay the malware, did you just support terrorism? You opened up another legal issue for yourself. Yeah. So you're kind of stuck. You either pay it or you don't. And if you don't, things are bad. And if you pay it, things could be bad. So there's all this really interesting, choices that you have to make now.
So one of the things on that, I was thinking about this from the conversation we had the other day, and Ron, you asked this question earlier about, CISOs and what are the new CISOs going to be like, right?
Right.
And I started thinking through this, and I said, what kind of CISO would I be, right? And you're going to get, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call them mercenary CISOs, right? You're going to go into an organization as a CISO and start watching the clock because you're going to get hacked, right? So can I do the best that I can and then get out before somebody comes out, before I get hit, right? And then you're going to have the guys that flow in, or gals that flow in after a company, right? Their specialty will be, cleanup, where they come in, get the program back on, and then they get out, right? So it's going to be very funny how this how drives the industry of CISOs besides the regulatory industry and how it drives companies.
Yeah, but you and I were talking about that because it's the case of, okay, if I'm going to come into your organization as a CISO, first thing I want to know is what's my technical and institutional debt? What am I actually taking on? What sins have you all committed? Now I'm the CISO. Am I liable for every decision that every other CISO or CTO made for the past 10 years? So when you come, I'm like, well, I wasn't even aware that we had chosen that tool, right? I was here, just a few months. And you're right. I think it's going to shorten the length of a tenure. I think right now it is about 18 or 24 months in the industry, but you're going to see a lot more churn. And I think you're right. You're going to see people who sort of specialize in cleanup, right? And then maybe some people who come in and do so, maybe just a hired gun for a period of time to fix a few things. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens.
Yeah. The other thing I'm wondering about is it going to cool any merger and acquisition activity?
It could. Actually, we've already seen that. So at my former company, Cognitio, we were doing work with a company who came to us after an M&A event. They turned down the M&A because the company said they had a lot of cyber risk and wanted to reduce the acquisition cost by almost 20%. So they came to us specifically to help them identify risk areas and remediate so that they could get back up to the full amount of money that had been on the table prior. Now, they were eventually sold to somebody else, but you saw that with Yahoo, right? When Yahoo was being purchased, that they came back and sued them to reduce the cost because of the cyber incident rate. So even now in M&A, it's going to be even more important for people to come in and do real good due diligence and kind of figure out your technical debt is creating huge risk. It's going to affect the amount that they make as an offer. It's going to really affect valuation. I have already seen that happen in the market space. And so it's only going to become more prevalent. How do you argue against that? So what do you have to, again, if I effectively show that I'm managing cyber risk in the enterprise, managing my attack surface, reducing human factors, getting the right intelligence, is that enough to keep the valuation and the multiples at the same spot? Or is it going to drive more companies to go private with PE money, right? Because private companies don't have to report.
Right. Lots of good questions. It's kind of making me ask, right now myself, if I was a CISO, would I feel comfortable? And, part of me thinks a little bit, if we got a lot of comments flowing in, hey, Kevin, Nicole, Chris, thanks for joining the stream. Drop if you would be a CISO, with today's climate into the chat. Would love to hear, what is your take on the conversation as well? When we look at the future, there's going to be some actions that happen naturally. We fight these allegations against us. If someone said, Ron, you didn't do your job as a security practitioner, I would feel very offended. And I'm sure that's how the CISO community is kind of feeling in a way, or at least the SolarWinds CISO is like, hey, I didn't actually do that. Yeah. Maybe all the information that I had wasn't as accurate as you like, but I'm innocent here. We saw the response from SolarWinds. We saw the response from the CISO. How do you think that influences everything? The fact that SolarWinds was like, actually, SEC, we're good. We didn't actually violate or commit any crimes.
Well, first off, it is the job of the prosecution to write an indictment as strong as they possibly can. Right? That's their job, right? And it is the job of the defendant to put up the most vigorous defense that they could, right? So, basically the SEC says you committed fraud. SolarWinds is saying, no, we didn't. You cherry picked, right? That's why we have the legal system, right? Is so people can put that in there and kind of figure it out. I think it's important that we as practitioners, potential CISOs, people that's on the sidelines, is that we just actually watch and listen to what happens, right? Because we really don't know everything that went inside. At least that's my perspective.
Well, but I think it's going to turn out, it is a wait and see, but are they going to sue Okta, right? So remember, Okta just had a big breach. So now they're looking at all the tech companies, and the tech companies are going to have to step up and actually create the appropriate kind of code and create assurance to companies. So now if you're the CTO and you're coming in, or the CISO, and you're going to make a decision, I'm going to buy product X, product Y, you have to think, well, what's my exposure going to be? What are they, how good are they at actually coding the things that they say they do? And am I buying down risk, or am I buying up my risk? right? So what's that investment look like for me? And every one of the companies is getting hacked because they become larger targets. And so again, it's going to create a lot of flow where you're going to have to make even harder decisions. And you're going to have to measure each product you purchase is going to come with some kind of risk, right? And you got
Yeah.
to figure that out.
No, I think you're right. I think the other part of that is this whole one of the things in the indictment was, that they had a third party assessor come in, did some assessments, gave them some recommendations, and the CISO signed off on the recommendations, and then lo and behold, the SEC saying you never implemented them, right?
Well, yeah.
Um, I don't know if that's true, right? So in my experience, I've been around a lot of red teams and other kind of assessment type of organizations, but if you walk in and do an assessment on an organization and say, by the way, you've got a bad password policy, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this, you need to fix it. And then they come back 3 years later and they say, well, you still have bad passwords.
Right.
Well, okay. Does that mean I didn't fix the things between then and there? Right. The reality is you have security entropy, right?
Yeah, right.
Networks are living things. They change. Employees come, they go, they do different things. Some of them are smart enough to drop, shadow IT on the network for you, all kinds of stuff, right?
Well, but there's always shadow IT. But I mean, again, full disclosure, I used to work for Netscape and Sun, and I would go in. I was one of the people that went in to fix things. And even in our assessments at Cognitio, what we typically saw are people purchase technology, but they never implement it correctly or fully. We were with a company doing a large assessment, and they said, "Hey, we noticed you purchased Splunk." And they're like, "Oh yeah." I'm like, "Well, what do you do with it?" They're like, "Man, we're not sure. It just alerts us to some stuff." I'm like, "Well, what do you do with the alerts?" We don't know. But we implemented it because we're supposed to have Splunk. And nothing against Splunk. I think they're a wonderful company. I am not disparaging Splunk in any way. I'm just saying that sometimes companies purchase technology and they don't exactly know what to do with it. And,
No, yeah. No, I get you. And that's my point, right? My point is not only is the stuff that you're buying not necessarily configured correctly, right? But security entropy happens, right? So, and there's a lot of companies that sit there and say, hey, we're a breach attack simulation. We're going to measure your security entropy. No, they're not. They're going to measure certain things at a point in time. If you're not continuously measuring that relationship between threat, vulnerabilities, and defensive controls, you're opening your door up to what the SEC is charging.
well, you are, but that goes to technical debt, right? So I think again, what you're coming in and you're saying, okay, this enterprise has been running for 25 years. They have made every kind of decision in the past 25 years that you possibly can based on market dynamics, Gartner research, industry best practices. We follow ISO 27001, we follow COBIT, and they still get hacked because all you're doing is you're layering technology all the time. And there's all these little APIs and things that, duct tape, right? Perl scripts that run that do things, that. I used to be really good at Perl script, but I can fix anything with Perl script. But again, so the problem is you have to come in and understand no enterprise recaps and pushes everything down and starts fresh. They don't do like a whole versioning, like we're going to create version 2. Everything is layered on and everything continues to grow and grow. And that's where a lot of the risk comes from the technical side. But more importantly, most of the risk really comes from human people. If you actually look at almost every breach, it's a human factor breach, right? That led to the problem. So they just don't address that very well. I'm sorry, where are we?
We're talking about getting rid of people.
We told you, Ron, that we don't stop.
We're covering a lot of ground, and the beauty about something like this, and the kind of the beauty and disaster about something like this, is it's a continuous conversation. This is going to keep on unfolding. We're going to have to keep on reinvestigating what happened, why it happened, who it's happening to. Like you're saying, Pat, behind every great case, there's a defendant, and right now it's the CISO. It might ultimately shift into being someone else. We spent a lot of time talking about, the challenge and the complexity of this recent event and now the role of the CISO. But let's talk about a little bit about the solution. Pat, you alluded to it in a little bit of a degree where you said, hey, this is what the indictment mentioned. It mentioned threat, it mentioned exposures, it mentioned risk. So what is that logical first step that we should be thinking about to not find ourselves in court.
Yeah. So I akin it back to the days of being in school, right? Figure out what the professor wants you to say and then go say it, right? And the SEC has said it, right? In the 106 S&K regulation, item 106 basically says, tell us the process you use to assess, identify, and manage risk. I've mentioned it several times because I think it's really important, right? So what is that process, right? And oh, by the way, since we've layered in threat, really what we're saying is, or what they're saying is, build a threat model, figure out who's coming after you, right? Identify where they're coming at you at, right? Your vulnerabilities, or maybe it's a phone call, spear phishing, vishing type of thing, right? And then figure out your defensive controls against it. So what are your people, policies, and technologies that you've got aligned to that? Right. And then you have to manage it. And oh, by the way, you have to continuously manage it. You just can't put it in there and forget about it. Right. Just have to keep rolling it and let it go. And if you put that plan together, and like I said, that makes it well reasoned. And if it's well reasoned, it's defendable.
No, I agree. On this one, I totally agree with you, Pat. I would like to be a sophist and argue with you, but I think you're correct. We agree. I know for once.
Yeah, no, I know. It's the same thing you ask for your kids, right? Just tell me why you're going, why'd you jump off that bridge? Oh, I don't know. Yeah,
Well,
okay.
but I think it goes deeper than that in some fashion. I think what the SEC is, they're telling everyone to wake up. And they're saying, look, cyber has got to be revealed. The only way that we're going to be able to be better, effective managers and recover from cyber incidents is if there is enough disclosure, and stop shielding it and hiding it in some closet somewhere. Let's all come out and talk about it, and let's actually take some action that makes sense. And I think that's what they're trying to really do. It's a lever action, which is saying, look, we all know that everybody has had a cyber event. And in fact, many clients we go to, every one of them says secretly, eventually they'll come over and say, we had a cyber event. And so I think now what we're saying is, hey, it's okay to talk about it because you're not any different than anybody else. It's just waiting your turn. So like we've had, I just have to run faster than the slowest guy in cyber. Like, no, it doesn't really work that way. It doesn't at all.
I'm going to be kind of, I'm going to take the good and the bad in that whole thing, right? The first thing I think the action that the SEC is doing about assess, identify, and manage is going to improve overall, right? So we're going to have a rough spot for the next 5 years, right? We're going to have some case law. We're going to have some things. We're going to have some people get hurt. Trust me, right? But so I think that will get better, right? So I think the CISO's job will get better in 5 years. Yeah. I don't think reporting incidences are going to have any difference.
Well, this one I disagree. I think it's important to bring things to light, right? And if you can talk amongst yourselves or if everything's out in the open, then I think it makes it easier for remediation to occur. And I think that we can create better methodologies to identify risk, but more importantly, remediate. You're going to get hit. So you can never stop the cyber attack, right? You're going to get hit. So the goal now is how quickly do you recover? How quickly do you remediate? What are really good tactics and ways or methodologies to do that, to maintain business operations while you take care of the cyber mess. And I think that this, at least the discussion is going to become more public, and people are going to finally acknowledge that this exists. Because now it's always been, it's just those tech guys and they just do tech things. No, this can actually put you out of business.
So I'll agree with you on that point that it will raise awareness, right? But it's not going to stop the number of hacks, because that's a new vertical, right? That's in some ways it might actually increase it because they're going to drive more people to go into the business. Right? Well, but that's a conjecture statement. There's no truth.
That's the whole point of cybercrime. This is actually realizing that cybercrime is its own industry vertical. You and I talked about it.
Yes.
New players, there's investment, there is research and development. There are huge players that come and go. Companies spring up. People make tons of money from this. It is its own vertical, right? I'm sorry, what?
There's HR departments on the dark web, right? They have job postings, they have HR, they get medical benefits. It's crazy.
Yeah, you can get paid for this and like crazy money. I mean, so again, this is the thing, is that people don't realize how large of an industry it really is. and that it's so easy to take money from people in some ways, again, because they never address things like human risk, right? So I'm sorry, Ron, go. I know we're off the rails, Ron.
I was thinking we're gonna have to have like a little bit of like a face off between you two in the future. We're gonna pick like a hot topic and just let y'all debate all day.
No, this is why we go drink together. It's fun.
So we're kind of like winding down here, right? We've been going for about 40 minutes. Pat, this question is for you. Is very important. Is vital to our success as cybersecurity practitioners, and that's the use cases and the tools that we implement for these use cases. I know that readiness is one of the use cases that you're laser focused on. So talk to us a little bit about readiness and what tools are required in order to be ready from a defensive standpoint.
Right. So one of the things that Interpres does very well is that we help people understand their defensive readiness, right? And what does that mean, right? It means how are they configured to protect, detect, respond against a threat, right? So in normal day-to-day type of thing, let's say a CISO report breaks, so like a log4j or a move it or something like that, right? Generally what happens is each company logs into each of their different security components. They look through their detection logic, they figure out what's there, they put it in a spreadsheet, they map it to MITRE ATT&CK, they do some other things like that, right? Okay, gotcha. With Interpres, we do that automatically and we do it within an hour, right? So for one of our customers, they said that it would normally take them 6 weeks to figure out their exposure to move it. With us, it took 1 hour. With a recent company in the past, literally in the past 24 hours, it took us a half an hour to install on their network, integrate all their security products, understand their threat model, understand their gaps against the threats against them in 30 minutes, right? And they moved right into remediation hardening, right? So understanding what you have in your environment for us to work with you. Basically, if you have an EDR, SIEM, and a vulnerability scanner, we can help you out almost immediately. And then Roger's got the people aspect on it. CyberCon is, I always mispronounce your team name. You always call me Interpres. I can call you cyberconIQ 4967.
You can. So just a second on that. Now, so for us, what we do is we actually manage and measure human factors risk. So everybody comes in and we do something akin to a Myers-Briggs. You either know that you're a risk taker or a risk maker, and then we help you really measure your enterprise, legacy debt, right, and your institutional debt. And then we bring that together into a dashboard that shows you what you really have to work on and where you can report that. It's a good way to have a conversation with a non-technical person to understand cyber risk. And then we have a whole 3-year education curriculum to educate people and change their behavior, as opposed to getting stuck into, hey, I do 30 minutes of training a year, rote training that everybody knows the answer to, and I just check all these boxes. So we like to call it moving beyond checking the box, right? So if you really want to be interactive and proactive in managing risk, you want to come talk to us. Otherwise, check all those boxes you want, but it's not going to help you. It really won't.
If you want to identify and manage threat, what matters to you, come see us. Right?
That's right.
But, come check out our webpage, check out our CISO landing page to help CISO specifically with this area. Be glad to give you a demo. Glad to talk to you.
Yeah, I did want to, summarize all of this. I think that the most important piece about all of this is, one, working with the right partners like Interpres, like cyberconIQ, but to also be able to take a little bit of wisdom from a session like this. So I had a question for both of you. We'll start with you, Roger. Looking at all of this, synthesizing all the information, also reflecting on all the rebuttals that Pat gave you, what's that one piece of advice that you would give to CISOs, directors, architects, security leaders as a whole to be one step better and not find themselves in the case of, being litigated?
That's a long question. I think that any CISO really has to make sure that they understand chain of authority, right? What do I have the ability to do? How can I transact? What is my budget to transact when we have a cyber incident? People always do incident tabletops, and those are really good to do, and they're good practice. but I don't think that they necessarily hit every button, especially when you're in the middle of it because of the pressure. And I think what you really need to do is have that conversation between the CEO, a CTO, and the board and say, look, let's really, when push comes to shove, what is my authority to transact? And that's going to clear up a lot of things because you can say, well reasoned, this is why I took the action. This is what occurred. That limits your liability in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there has to be that discussion to say, and again, a good CEO who may not be technical has to give up some of that authority, even if they are the final decision maker, to have that pathway to trust in their CISO to make sure that they are enabling them appropriately. So make sure you understand what you can and can't do, right? Would be my take.
Well said. Make sure you understand that and do the things that you should do and don't find yourself in any trouble. Pat, wanted to, circle back with you, wrap all this up for us. Also, drop, what we would like the audience to do, drop that CTA at the end. But over to you. What's that one piece of advice that you would share to security leaders to avoid a situation like this?
I think they need to realize that at the end of the day, they're strategic planners now. Right? They're not doers. They're strategic planners, right?
Yes.
They have to build a plan that's strategic in nature. In other words, what is the environment that I'm operating in? Who's outside in that environment coming after me? It's not everybody, right? There's specific actors. Who are they, right? How am I going to defend against them? What are my capabilities, right? What are my gaps, right? What is my vulnerability patching methodology, right? Making sure they understand that relationship between the threat, their vulnerabilities, and the defensive controls. And it's documented, right? So that's what we talk about, building a well-reasoned, defendable, and documented program that they can take to the board, right?
Yep.
Because if the board votes them down, that's okay, right? They did what they're supposed to do. They got voted down. It's not on them anymore, right? At the end, because, dude, you're going to get sued if you're a CISO.
You are.
Right? That's just a fact of life now, right? So you have to put in pieces in place that says, I thought it out. I did the best that I could. This is how it was, right? If you walk in there and say, well, I gave it to a vendor to manage and they didn't do it, it's not my fault. Too bad it is, right? And at least you'll be negligible. Worse, you'll be committing fraud. If you think you're getting cyber insurance to cover you, cyber insurance is not going to cover you if they find you negligent, right?
Right.
And they're not going to cover you if they find you fraud. So you basically bought cyber personal insurance for nothing.
Well, right? we could have a whole session just on the insurance industry and how poorly they're handling cyber, but that's really based on data, right? They just don't have enough data for actuarial tables. And I think that, when you start to look at it, their risk engineers have a really hard time assessing what is remediation cost, what is risk cost, how do you recover reputational damage, and how do they split that risk among all their investors. They still have problems collecting enough data to really understand how to manage that.
Yeah, right. I didn't mean to open up that can of worms.
No, let's just bring that one right down.
But the reality is, like I said, you want to validate you want to build a security strategy. You want to validate your security strategy, right?
For sure.
Make sure it's against the threats that matter most. Yeah. The threats that matter most to you. Make sure your vulnerability patching makes sense. Make sure your defensive controls make sense.
Right. Correct.
Well said. And since we have a lot more to discuss, hopefully we get to do this again. I know that you'll be down if we are able to, Roger. So I'm excited about that. I did want to ask Pat before we wrap up. This is called Cyber Tales from the Trenches. Is this a new series? You let the audience know. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, so the Cyber Tales from the Trenches comes from basically reflecting back on my government days, right? And so a lot of what Interpres does and a lot of what we're talking about, measuring threat and going after from a threat perspective, came out of a program I ran in the government called DOD-CAR. You can Google it. It's there. Don't look at the YouTube videos. If you want to hear about Godzilla, that's another time that's really good. But we'll be doing more of these. We'll be doing more Tales from the Trenches, obviously with Roger and other special guests as we move around. Right. go to different topics and things like that? Because I have an opinion about everything, and I'm usually wrong. So it works out very well.
You have an opinion?
I have opinion masquerading as fact.
This has been so much fun. I have really had such a good time, and thank you very much. And Pat, thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we have reached the end. Wanted to say a big thank you to everyone that tuned in and watched the stream. Really love y'all. Also, there's a few resources that we just dropped into the chat. Be sure to give Interpres some love by visiting their website, checking them out, also signing up for a demo. Because I've personally seen it. I speak to every partner that I work with, Interpres being one of them. I've seen the product. It's really cool. When I was a threat intel analyst, I wish that I had this product. So I would highly recommend checking it out. Pat, Roger, thank you both again. And with that, we will see everyone next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.